But yeah, I graduated in 2011. But of course, the idea for this came years earlier when I was in grad school and coming up with project ideas. So I'm from New Jersey in the United States, and from a town which is about an hour's train ride outside of New York City. And being from there, I have a robust cot-caught distinction. So I'll say she slept on a cot, she caught the ball, and all the words in those word classes, which you may know as the short O and the long open O classes from reading LeBeau's work. They're very distinct. So cot-caught, tot-tot, don-don, etc. I noticed, though, in my own speech that when I was talking to friends from different regions, for example, Paul de Decker, that my contrast became less robust. So there was some accommodation going on where either, well, you know, it's hard to, not really eyeball, it's hard to earball these things in the wild in terms of the degree of difference you're making. But I would sometimes say, you know, oh, I caught this article in the journal, you know, realizing this long open O class in a way that was not how I usually realize it, and this seemed to be due to the people I was talking to. And accommodation is really, it's a whole fascinating topic, and why that happens, and the linguistics behind it is also pretty fascinating. So I was thinking about what this means for a speaker like me. Okay, I've got these two word classes, and if I'm talking to somebody like Paul, one or both of them maybe just alters its phonetic realization to be closer to that word category as I'm hearing it from him, right? So I'm hearing long open O's that sound like ah, and so I can take my long open O category, right, and just you know, maintain the category underlyingly, but later downstream phonetically implement it in a somewhat different way. Or possibly I could be applying a neutralization rule where I just take all my ahs and make them ahs on the surface. So there are different things that can happen. What becomes really interesting, though, is you think about what might happen in the opposite direction. So if somebody like Paul is talking to someone like me, he presumably has one phoneme for these two word classes, just something like an ah. But then he's hearing cots and caughts from someone like me. How would he go about accommodating to that? Well, under this view of phonology that I've been kind of talking within thus far, that should be a really hard task, right? Because he's got this one category, and in order to accommodate to the dialect of someone who has two categories, he would have to figure out for every lexical item that he has an ah for, well, is it supposed to keep its ah? Is it supposed to be one of these all words? So instead of doing just one thing, like I would be doing, so changing the phonetic implementation of my ah category or neutralizing it and thus applying one neutralization rule, he would have to be doing hundreds of things, right? Because there are hundreds of lexical items that fit into what he has as a single category. So you should see this real asymmetry where I should be able to accommodate, but he should have a difficult time with that, at least in a very short-term time span. And this sort of thinking actually is behind what is known as Herzog's principle, which LeBeau writes about in his Principles of Linguistic Change, Internal Factors volume, and elsewhere. So he has observed, like many dialectologists, that mergers tend to spread at the expense of distinction. So if you look at what's happening in North America, for instance, we have a lot of regions which still have a cot-caught distinction, like where I'm from, in the north, of course New York City, parts of the south. So there's a lot of places where there's a distinction. There's a lot of places where the merger is prevalent, so most of Canada and the West, parts of New England, the United States. And if you go to NWAVE, which of course is our big variationist conference, there's nearly always a paper or two talking about merger in progress in some other region. Right? So the merger seems to be spreading, and if you think about that sort of community or sort of large geographic change, it seems to have a very straightforward explanation in terms of this asymmetry, right? So it's very easy to drop or nearly neutralize a distinction, but really hard to gain one. So that had been the sort of received wisdom on that topic. But there's more than one theory of phonology out there. So a lot of sociophoneticians in particular have been very enamored of exemplar theory and other sort of usage-based theories. And in these theories, you don't operate simply at a level of these abstract phonemic categories, like some sort of symbol that corresponds to ah, and some sort of symbol that corresponds to aw, that are then manipulated by phonology and can give rise to these sorts of asymmetries. You have this additional level of representation where for each lemma you hear, or lexical item or word, maybe I'll just use words, it's a little easier. For every word that you hear, you're not just getting a signal, stripping away all the phonetic and social detail, and kind of at base perceiving this abstract string of phonemes, but you're actually retaining all of that phonetic richness in the signal and storing it as part of the representation. So every time I hear an instance of the word caught, I kind of file away what I heard. There's some discussion about what the shape of that representation looks like. Is it acoustic? Is it articulatory? Kind of leave that aside for now. So under this sort of view of phonological representation, you would expect the asymmetry, which I previously described, to not really hold, right? Because if we're making changes at the word level and we're retaining the information we're hearing, then it should be no harder for someone like Paul to learn a distinction than it is for me to learn to not distinguish them so much, right? Because if he starts out with this sort of clump of representations of ah, which is built up of all the times he's heard she slept on a cot, he caught the ball, right? Caught and caught and taught and taught, and all of these words which are different words would just overlap for him. But if then he goes into a situation where he's hearing people produce lots of caught, 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 you would expect his representations for those sorts of words to slowly, gradually diverge over time, and that should be reflected in his production of these items, where you'd start to see smaller and then gradually larger differences in how these two word classes are realized. So I was thinking about that and thinking, oh, well, this is a great opportunity to be able to sort of dig into these two theories and bring some sociolinguistic data to bear on that. I actually got my start as a linguist, as a phonologist. I came at it from more the formal end. I got into linguistics because I really loved problem sets and coming up with generalizations and accounting for stuff. And that's not really changed, actually. I'm still like that. But I've kind of leveled up on the data in terms of bringing in all this messiness that comes in the sociophonetic data. Okay, so anyway, so how do you go about testing these sorts of different theories? You have to draw out predictions that they might make. And I've kind of talked through one already where you would expect an asymmetry in the sort of more abstractionist model of phonological representation. You wouldn't necessarily expect that with an exemplar-based model. So this is the sort of thing I wanted to test with my dissertation. I looked at Canadians in New York because they provide a great test case of people who are born and raised in a region which has a merger between these vowels. Not if they're from Newfoundland, of course. It's a separate case. But if they're from the rest of Canada, you can be pretty well assured that they grew up speaking a dialect which has the Cot-Quat merger. And then they moved to New York, where they're suddenly marinating in exemplars of cot and quat. So getting all this new input, and the question is, what do they do with it? Do they hear this new phonetic variation and kind of strip it away and just take from that what word they're hearing, or do they actually store that phonetic variation? And can we see evidence of that in the speech of people who've been here for a while? So in that respect, it's actually my my way of finding my community was very different than the way we typically do things in sociolinguistics, right? So a lot of times people will have some community they're interested in for very good social reasons, right? So some sort of community where you have social stratification of various kinds, which will probably be reflected in linguistic behavior, or maybe some interesting gender or racial dynamic that's happening in a particular place. And then you go see, well, okay, how does that work itself out in terms of the language? And I kind of started at the opposite end and said, okay, so I got to find some people who have one phoneme. And then suddenly they get all this input where there's a distinction there. Who would that be? And I thought, oh, well, obviously Canadians in the New York region. And so that's how I chose that particular group of people. I feel like I've been talking for a long time, so feel free to bust in with a question or interject at some point. Is there anything else you particularly want to know, a direction I should go in?
Right. Well, that's a good introduction to what the paper's about and how you got into it. So I'm sure we all have something to ask you, or some of us do, and so if anyone has any questions, we'll turn it over to us now.
Okay.
Sarah does. I know Sarah does.
On exemplar theory, but I would imagine that you could get an asymmetry with the exemplar theory as well. I'm like watching myself as I talk. It's kind of weird. Because if you've got you have two word classes. You have one and a second right? And you have exemplars of that second in cot. I can't remember which is the one that I don't have.
Here.
You can't see the word that's written in my book, right?
Learners have the merger, they just have it further forward.
Right.
Yeah, thanks. But it makes sense to me then if you've got a group of clouds with one sound and a group of clouds with a different sound, that you can make abstractions based on different word classes, cot 1, cot 2. Right? But I don't have that. I have no clouds for those things. It's just one giant messy space. So it makes sense to me that there's a second level of abstraction that you can do after you have these clouds.
Yes.
That's different than what I could be doing. I'm not really sure if I'm making an actual question there.
Right. Yeah, I get it. So. So I kind of, I'm going to spin this to make it sound like I planned it that way. I got around this very craftily and cleverly by actually not comparing natively distinct people with natively merged speakers in these sort of cross contexts, right? So the counterpart study, which someday I hope to do, would be New Yorkers going to Canada. What I did was actually compare two features within this set of speakers. So when you have, how should I say this? Okay, so in addition to the Kakot merger / distinction, I looked at Canadian raising and to what extent this was lost. So these two features have either very different status or potentially a very similar status depending on what your theory of representation is. So in a more abstractionist theory, like the way that we learn about these things in Phonology 1, Canadian raising is something you can accomplish via a rule. So like a single thing where you take the diphthong I in a pre-voices context and raise its nucleus to get, I won't produce it in a room full of Canadians. I feel too self-conscious, but you all know what it sounds like. So on the one hand, you have this thing which is straightforwardly accounted for by a rule. On the other hand, you have something like a distinction, which has to involve this sort of deeper level of two different categories, which raises questions of, well, you have to form those two categories, and then you have to figure out where everything fits. So in that view of things, these two things are very different. In a usage-based or exemplar-based theory, these two things, or more specifically changes in either of these features, are not necessarily accomplished in these two very different ways, where it's a matter of modifying the rule versus first figuring out there's two categories and then figuring out where things fit into that. but change can actually happen in both of them in a very similar way. So you have all these, you come to New York as a Canadian, you have all your outs and abouts and couches, and you can just take all those words and shift them a little lower. Similarly, you have your cots and your cots, and you can take each of those words and shift them away from where you originally produced them. So that was kind of how I tried to get into that, tried to get around that difficulty. Of course, nowadays, when I was crafting my dissertation, there was still very much this opposition between exemplar theories, where you just store all the exemplars, versus SPE type theories, where you just have these abstract categories. And I think most people who work in exemplar theory, at least in sociophonetics at this stage, they don't really believe that these are two separate oppositional things, which of course is how I set up this opposition in this paper, which I wrote, when I was doing my dissertation. Now people believe in a hybrid model, right? They acknowledge that these abstract categories have really bought us something in the history of phonology. Like we knew stuff about phonology and how it worked, and like phonemes are pretty handy. So we want to incorporate those abstract categories. So people now talk about the sort of dual system, where you have exemplar level representations, which have this phonetic detail, but they can also give rise to these more abstract categories. So in your parametric phonetic space, where you store all these exemplars, you get these clumps showing up, and some of these clumps can get translated into more abstract categories. So if you have a clump of awes, then the learner can at some point posit a more abstract category of awe that comes from this. I forget the question that was asked.
Well, I guess I never actually asked the question, but you did.
Okay.
Except it brought up another question, but maybe I should let somebody else ask.
If it's a related question, maybe.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
Yeah, go for it.
Because I don't think Canadian raising is doing the same sorts of things that the COT1, COT2 thing is doing. Because COT1, COT2 is not predictable, right? So you're sort of...
Right.
I didn't know that I had Canadian raising until I was taught that in a linguistics class. And I still don't hear it. So you say right exactly the same way that I say right by my perception. And if I'm not perceiving the difference, I just know that I'm making a difference. I'm not sure that it's as accessible for me to change as it would be for you to say, okay, well, all of my cots are just one cot now.
Right, so this raises the question of to what extent awareness is important for acquisition of these new features. And I'm actually working on a book chapter on this very topic. There was, in the not the last, but the previous LSA, I was on a symposium on awareness and control in sociolinguistic research. So this question of like, well, first of all, how do we talk about awareness, which is really sticky. But to what extent does a sort of conscious awareness affect how people, in my case, how they might acquire new dialect features, but there's lots of questions could be asked, right? Like how does conscious awareness affect how people may style shift or otherwise deploy different socially meaningful linguistic variables? The awareness thing is interesting. I think it changes when you're in a dialect context situation. So I'm actually kind of surprised to hear you say that, but maybe I shouldn't be surprised. But if you come to America and you talk, like, you won't be surprised because obnoxious Americans will be like, aha, you say about you're Canadian. So it's an extremely marked feature on this side of the border, and I'm surprised that like the media that hasn't trickled over. Like,
I don't know, like, I mean, I know I've grown up knowing Americans think I say about funny.
Sure.
I don't say about, I say about. But then I just thought American was weird, and it was based on like one Canadian that went there.
Oh, I see, right. Like a movie or something.
So,
I guess similarly, I also don't hear the difference, and so I always thought, like you, Sarah, that it always sounds really silly when I hear Americans making fun of Canadians, because I've never heard the difference between the raising and the not raising, and so when Americans or cartoons say like "oot and a boot," like I know they're making fun of something, but I can't. I feel like I'm outside the joke. I'm not part of it.
Okay. Right, yeah, because certainly you don't say the sort of stereotyped version, which is oot in a boot, because that's
Are there regions of Canada which do say oot and a boot?
not that I know of, but you guys are there, so.
There
There
are
are,
from somewhere in Ontario, and she would say the dude. Oops.
I don't think that was real. I was in an airport and I heard it once, and I was like, "This is the person that the general."
Yeah.
Well, you know, of course I can't speak for all Canadians, but I can speak for the ones in my sample. And I do have to say that Canadian raising was, in nearly all cases, the first feature that people mentioned, often unsolicited, right? So you always have this sort of secrecy or you hide things, right, when you recruit people to do sociolinguistic reviews. And I had said something like, well, I'm interested in differences in communication between Canadians and Americans. I had to say that much because they saw on the form that they signed, the consent form, that I'm in a linguistics department, so I couldn't really get beyond that. But I just said communication. I didn't talk about accent necessarily, but everyone was like, oh yeah, I've tried to stop. I've tried to stop using a, and I've tried to not. I've tried to say about. So this was a feature for these particular speakers that was very salient, which, I mean, it's hard to say when that salience arose for them. Maybe it didn't happen until they started interacting with Americans and realized that it was something that really outed them as not being from the States. So they're all very aware of it, which, of course, would raise this question, like, well, probably something weird is going to go on with that feature. I mean, when we construct sociolinguistic studies, generally, we worry about this, right? We worry about people being focused on aspects of their speech and then modifying it, and that's why we do a sociolinguistic interview, and as well as all our more structured tasks to kind of triangulate and try to figure out what do they do when they're least conscious of what they're doing. So, so given that, you might expect, well, maybe these people would, because they're consciously aware of this feature, actually attenuate it even more. So that might interfere with what we're looking at because, you know, I want to show that there's some sort of difference maybe between how these features are realized, or really maybe I'm hoping for no difference in line with this exemplar way of looking at things. But my results are going to get all fuzzy and screwed up because people will just not do oat in a boat because of this stereotype, and then it'll look very much like that feature is just very easily acquired, more so than the cat-pot distinction. And like, what kind of conclusions can I draw about anything? Well, I was surprised that actually in my interviews, people continued to Canadian raise, particularly in out and about, which is funny because these are the words that you know everyone was like, well, you know, I've tried, and I think I've been pretty successful about not saying out and about anymore. One guy was like, well, so this guy was actually a doctor, and I interviewed him in a hospital, and he was like, well, I probably slip up and say, like, goat for gout. But out and about, I don't say that anymore, because everybody, as soon as Americans hear that, they say, hi, you're Canadian, I got you. But despite this hyper-awareness and this real will to change it, everybody was still super raised in their interviews. So a lot of people continued to raise in all words that had this context. Other people, interestingly, they showed significant raising only in the words out and about, but not in words like couch and pout. Those actually seemed a little lower. So that's what awareness did for my sample. And I had some things to say about this, I believe in the paper that you read, focusing on like the context, right? So this is it's a very Canadian-friendly environment being interviewed by me. I knew what their national identity was, so that wasn't really an issue of being outed. We were talking a lot about Canada versus the U.S., so these sort of, you know, if you're being fancy and sociolinguistic about it, you might say it's their identity coming out. If you're kind of being boring and psychologist-like about it, you might say, well, they're being primed. In any case, like the ows are coming out in this particular context.
I guess, and I will let other people talk after this. My question wouldn't be just, are they aware that they're doing something funny with, like, out and about or whatever, but if they could actually hear the difference in somebody else's speech so that they're actually able to store different sort of exemplar clouds of right, or if they're all, like, everything that they're perceiving is getting fit into the same kinds of, like, I'm missing terminology here, but
Right, yeah. So there's like three. We could talk about maybe three categories of variant. There's like about, there's a boat, and there's a boot. Right. So there's like the lowered, there's the raised that people actually do, although probably not how I actually produced it, because that's not my native variety, versus the stereotype version. And all of my speakers were aware that the stereotype version is ridiculous, and nobody says that. They could perform their own variety, or like contrast how they would say a boat back home versus how they would say about. So they were making those distinctions. Now, what does this mean for how people store things if they hear? Well, I think the idea is that you take in a lot of information, and that sort of there isn't that filtering at the front end where differences that are not made at a more abstract level are just immediately filtered out. They're taken in, and they're all stored, and then what actually is noticed can be very different from what you perceive. I'm trying to think of, I mean, there are analogies, right, in other types of perception. So, like, visually speaking, you take in a lot of information, but you're not necessarily aware of everything in your visual field, right?
yeah. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
So the reason, or so the difference, the observation that you found that Canadian raising was harder to get rid of than forming a new category. Is so you must be familiar with Jack Chambers' work in the UK, where he had migrants from Canada go to the UK, and he also found something similar, that if there's a phonological rule, it was harder to undo that phonological rule than to merge or separate some segmental category. So is there? I guess how does that work with the exemplar model? If you're hearing the sounds, if the exemplar model was just a sponge that absorbed everything you hear, and then you produce what was stored up, that wouldn't account for why Canadian raising still lingered on, right?
Okay, well, so I want to address a few premises in that question. The first one is about acquiring new categories, which actually I forget what I said in this paper, but I don't think that that's actually necessarily what happened. So what they show in their speech is that there are differences between the, Wells has solved this problem we had, the thought and the lot lexical sets, right? So there's a significant distinction between them, and it's not all attributable to phonological context, right? So there's a bit of the variation which you need these word class categories to account for. So they're certainly making differences between words in these groups. Whether that translates into a difference at this more abstract level, I think the jury's out, and I suspect that that's the sort of thing that may happen later, but not necessarily at the same time as these phonetic changes. I think that because there's a lot of variation in the extent to which my speakers were aware of this difference in their own speech or in the speech of others. So some people could totally characterize like, oh, ah versus aw, and they talked about it in the way that non-linguists talk about these sort of differences. But it was clear that they knew there was a difference in the new dialect, and they were sort of aware of the phonetics of this. But some people who were making this little, and I want to stress that it's a baby distinction. It's not like caught versus caught. It's very subtle, right? There were people who were making this distinction who had no idea. Yeah. And if you think about like how these sort of more abstract contrasts typically work, people are often aware of them, right? So they know that E is a different sound than I. Like beat and bit are definitely different, and boot and boat are definitely different. But this one is kind of weird because you don't have that same sense of, oh yeah, ah and aw are different sounds. So this is the sort of thing that's kind of a puzzle if you think about like traditional phonemics, where okay, well if there's a difference between caught and caught, we need two symbols. We need a caught and we need an ah phoneme and an aw phoneme. But then it's kind of weird because, well, why is ah and aw behaving differently than E and I if they're all just different symbols? So yeah, I'm actually working on a paper with Daniel Ezra Johnson of Lancaster University in the UK, looking at this particular issue, because he actually had some similar speakers in his dissertation work, where he looked at speakers in New England, some of whom had grown up in a merged area and moved to a distinct area, and started to make these little baby distinctions between these word classes, but still lots of overlap. People were not aware that they were doing it, and so what does this mean for the representation of those? It seems like you can get word-level representations diverging before you get this difference at a more abstract level. That was one thing I said. Oh, the other thing you mentioned about Chambers' work. So if I recall correctly, the rule that he looked at that was hard to undo was the flapping rule, right?
The which one?
The flapping rule.
Oh,
so,
yes, right. Yeah.
So saying water instead of water.
Yeah.
And that one I would put an asterisk by in terms of rules, because I think that, I mean, this is kind of anecdotal based on my own experience and talking with others, so take it for what it is. But for me, as an American who lived in the UK for 2 years, there were there's a lot of features that differ between my English and the English of the region I was in. But for me, coming from an American context, whatever linguistic impetus there might have been to stop flapping, that was sort of dominated by star don't sound pretentious constraint. Yeah, star pretentious, right? Because if you're an American who says water, like you sound like kind of a word I probably shouldn't say on the YouTube channel. So I don't know about that. I would be really interested to compare flapping with some other rule that is applied but is not so salient a difference, where you're not like over-articulating. And I'm not sure what that rule might be. I'll think on that.
But for me, and I wasn't a member of your study, so but for me, you probably would have found the opposite. It was easier for me to stop Canadian raising than it was, or more beneficial for me to stop Canadian raising than to start distinguishing my low back vowels, because it outed me as being Canadian. So and I thought, okay, well, I'm going to have to live with this for the rest of my life, or I'm going to lose Canadian raising. And so it was much easier. Maybe it was I knew, because I was a linguist, I knew all I had to do was change a rule, and everything should fall into place. And so it bought me a lot more than separating the low back vowels. If I didn't distinguish the low back vowels, for the most part, there wasn't a lot of confusion. Nobody really got confused about what I was saying, because context determined. Except in one case when I was looking for Diamandis Scaphos' apartment on Water Street, and some guy didn't know what I was talking about. And so I kept asking, where's Water Street? And he's like, I don't know. There's no street called that. And then finally, after like 6 or 7 times after saying it, he's like, oh, you mean Water Street? So there's a lot actually there. There's the vowel, there's the flap, there's the lack of the R.
Yeah.
So yeah, but that then I wouldn't go. I think I stopped at undoing Canadian raising, and I didn't go as far as like acquiring non-roticity. But then again, there's probably like social class issues.
Oh yeah, yeah. Roticity is a whole other thing. So yeah, so I.
Caught, right? Like it's local, but it's not necessarily prestigious. Like it doesn't buy you social capital beyond local.
Yes. So yeah. So I think I said some things about that in that paper. They all sort of blend together. Where I said what, who knows? And I think that's right. So my suspicion is that if I were able to surreptitiously record these speakers in contexts where they weren't with a Canada-friendly person talking about Canada, if they were just in some other context where maybe they're meeting new people, they would probably not raise as much. And that would be definitely due to the social meaning of that feature. My other suspicion related to that is that if I looked at their caught vowels, you would not see that sort of style shift because it's for the most part below the level of awareness. It doesn't have this social meaning attached to it in terms of the contrast per se. So Lebov talks a lot about this, right? If mergers are below the level of conscious awareness, people may be kind of clued into the phonetic realization of a particular vowel in that contrast. Like they may be aware that you would say coffee, but they are not necessarily aware of the difference or non-difference per se. And actually, so there may be something going on there in terms of that coffee stereotype, because when I looked at the sort of divergences that people were doing between lot-type words and thought-type words, their thoughts really did not show as much evidence of shift. It was really their lots becoming a little fronter, and less, yeah, really fronter. And my suspicion is that this may be due to some sort of inhibiting effect of like not wanting to raise and back in awe, but the movement of awe was relatively unimpeded. So Paul, I wish I had recorded you during grad school, because I wonder if you were maybe making a little baby distinction, which is the sort of thing that you wouldn't necessarily be able to identify, because again, like the distribution of cot versus the distribution of cot are highly overlapping. So being able to identify which one you're making in a particular token, like you probably would be able to do it, but just looking at a whole sample of realizations and statistically speaking, this comes out when you can do things like control for all the phonological factors. So I wonder.
Yeah. I don't think there are any recordings from that era. I didn't really see them.
No, there's a recording that Dan Johnson made of our methods talk.
Oh, okay, there you go. You can take that then.
I'm gonna get okay.
That's right. So the other thing, and then I'll let other people ask questions. Was that with one of the other factors that might prevent people from stopping raising would be the fact that there's more than one rule going on with Canadian raising. There's the raising rule, but there's also the vowel shortening rule before voiceless stops.
Right.
So it's hard to lower your nucleus in a short duration.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd have to undo. First, you'd have to make the vowel longer, and then you'd have to lower. I mean, maybe you can do them all at the same time, but there's more than just lowering involved with it. So that could be an extra like a strike against getting rid of this rule if it's more complicated than phonetically something that falls below the radar, and you could just phonetically drift apart for the low back vowels.
Mm-hmm. I am so glad you made that point, because I actually looked into that, right? Because this is a worry. My initial concern about this issue came from a slightly different angle, which is that especially if you look at words like out and about. They're function words. They're super frequent, and we know that super frequent words tend to be reduced in duration. So is it the case that the continued raising effect that I'm seeing in these words is just an artifact of the fact that they're really short? And so I ran additional models where I included duration as a term for the raising items, and as the first term too. So it's a very conservative test where duration gets the first crack at accounting for F1 values, and if there's anything left over for, you know, raising versus non-raising type of word versus out versus about, then you really know that you're looking at something. And when I build duration into the model, the group that a word falls in, whether it's out or about or another raising context word or a non-raising word, that still comes out as significant in pretty much all cases. Yeah, actually, in all cases, although there was some differences between like out and about that may be neutralized. So duration is certainly a big predictor of this, but it's not. It doesn't account for all of the difference.
Right. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Go for it.
So this is really interesting to know about, to read this article. I mean, in my experience, I had thought that only non-English natives, non-native speakers have the problem in, I mean, which English to choose to learn. Yeah, because when I was in Australia, because when I was in China, I learned English mostly from American sources. I mean, in American accent, English in American accent. So when I went to Australia, I speak in probably in American accent. So, and I mean, people there, they said that, oh, your American accent was horrible. I felt not good, actually, not good. So at that time, I started to think which variety of English shall I should choose to learn, and then when I came here in Canada last year, I think I don't have. I'm not, I was not so bothered by this problem because, and today I realized that, wow, English native speakers have the same problem in which variety of English to choose to speak. I mean, so in this journal paper, I am more interested in the identity, the Canadian identity. So, in my understanding, in at least Canadian adults in New York City try to demonstrate their Canadian identity when taking the interviews with an Canadian interviewer. So, do you think the interviewer, I mean, the accent, or no, the identity of the interviewer and the topic of the interview do influence the interviewee's choice of their linguistic variation?
Yeah, definitely. So I think definitely in the case of Canadian raising, and my suspicion is not so much with caught, but and I thought about this, but I think it's actually in a sense good because that makes it a very conservative study of second dialect acquisition because I basically put them in a context where, like, if they're going to revert to their D1 and kind of not show me the D2 features they've acquired, that's the context they're going to do it in. So that makes me feel, well, you know, it does give rise to this result with Canadian raising, which I think would not be seen if I got them in other contexts. With respect to the caught distinction, I think it's pretty revealing because now, I mean, they're talking to me, and I'm from New Jersey, and so of course I worried about what if, I'm such a big, compelling personality. Probably they're going to just imitate me the whole time, but that doesn't seem to be happening. So I looked back, and if anything, I was accommodating. I had and now I want to talk about. I listen to this, and I think that's not my vowel.
Yeah.
So they don't seem to be getting a cut distinction from accommodating to me, and they're talking about a topic which, if anything, would favor more Canadian-sounding realizations of those.
Right.
Yeah. There was some interesting style shifting too, which I don't think I reported in this paper. So, in addition to talking to people for an hour, a couple of hours, I had them read a word list of randomized words as you do, and complete one of these sociolinguistic minimal pair tasks. So you give the people the sheet of paper which has caught, don, and filler pairs, and say, read each of these and tell me if you think they sound the same or different. So I had them do this task, and everybody behaved like a Canadian. So while they were making these baby distinctions in their conversational speech, when I looked at what was happening in the minimal pair test, everyone said, oh, these are the same, and they were right. When you look at it, they made no difference between these words in the minimal pair context. And then I went back and I handed them a list and I said, are there any pairs here that you think New Yorkers would say differently? And that's where some interesting variation came out, where some people were like, oh yeah, they say cot and pot, and other people just had no idea, and totally focused on other sort of features like coda R, for instance. So there was this interesting sort of effect where I kind of asked them to do this minimal pair task and focus on how do you produce these words. They're still referring to these norms that they've grown up with, where pot and pot, they're the same. Of course they sound the same, and they produce them the same. And it's only in this conversational context where the difference is coming out. So there does seem to be this stability at some abstract level where they think of these things as the same and indeed produce them, realize them as the same. But when they're not focused on how they say these things, how they presumably currently actually say them, is what I'm seeing.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I have a question about lexical stuff in the words.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any words? I'm thinking like Matt Hunt Gardner stuff, where people who move to Newfoundland, they say St. John's after a few years, but Long John's, right? They make distinctions when they have sort of local salience or local connotations. Did you get any of that? Did you get people doing weird things with coffee or?
I didn't.
Places maybe.
I did not see that with the things you would suspect, like coffee and I guess what would there are a lot of New Jersey names I can think of, like Secaucus and Galway, but there were some interesting lexical effects at the individual level. So there was a woman who worked for the ASPCA, so she dealt with a lot of animals and things, and she produced 60 tokens of the word dog, and her dogs were really raised, and they became more raised throughout the interview. It was just life is really fine. So for her, I mean, obviously it's a word she hears all the time. She's getting lots of instances of it, so it's not surprising that word is particularly raised for her.
Which really problematizes the idea of frequency counts based on your data, because it has nothing to do with what people actually necessarily hear in their daily lives, right?
Well, yeah, so the way that I counted frequency was just based on the individual interview. So a count, if she said dog 64 times, that got 64. If someone else uses dog 5 times, that got a frequency of 5 for them. So that's really problematic if we were talking about really random topics that they would never talk about, because then you would get these artificially high frequencies for birds, and maybe you wouldn't hear as much words that would probably be actually frequent in their daily experience. But these were things about people's jobs, and there were topics that were very relevant. So the fact that the woman who works with animals for a living uses dog a lot. That's kind of not crazy. The fact that the woman who's a psychoanalyst on the Upper West Side uses the word father over a dozen times, it's also surprising. So that was definitely something I checked for, and there were no cases where there was just some fluke context where we talked a lot about saunas or something, counting frequency is complex. Because you want to reflect the actual input someone gets, because that's going to shape how they produce things. But it's also kind of fraught, and you have to make decisions.
I want to ask a sociolinguistic question, because it's been all linguistics for an hour, and linguistics is boring.
Oh, sure. You sound like my sociolinguistic variation class.
Imagine that. The idea of sort of linguistic sensitivity that you bring up at the end, which is similar to sort of, I guess, in applied linguistics, to talk about communicative competence and stuff like this. That gets sort of in a backdoor way at this whole thing that we choose not to discuss about whether some people are better at language than others. You want to say something fun about that?
Sure. So I would hesitate to use the word better. So I don't have an applied linguistics background, but I do read a lot in social psychology and that sort of thing. So I've been thinking about it more in terms of attention and how you assign attention. So right now I'm analyzing some data from a pilot study I did this year, looking at people imitating, although imitation is kind of a funny word to use, because they're not instructed to imitate. It's one of these Goldinger type imitation tasks where you bring people in, you have them produce words from a word list, and then you have them do some other task which involves them listening to words spoken by voice over headphones, many of which are present on that list they produce. These words differ, these target words differ in some interesting way. So in this case, I'm looking at, people come in produce no distinction between caught and caught. They're hearing a voice which has this distinction. So after they hear this voice, they repeat the first task of reading this word list, and are there any differences in the before and after that could be attributed to this middle person? So I'm looking at those vowel differences. I've also got a bunch of words with voice to socks with the BOT, because this effect has been well replicated for BOT, and it'll show me that my thing is actually working. The difference here is I'm looking at the variation between people and the extent to which there's a shift between before and after, and linking it to various measures of personality. So I had them do a questionnaire which assigns them a number for the big 5 personality traits. So these are extroversion and neuroticism, openness, those sorts of things. And also, they did a questionnaire getting at this construct called self-monitoring, which refers to the extent to which people monitor or pay attention to things around them, and to what extent they alter their own behavior to be in response to that. So my hypothesis is that people who are higher self-monitors, maybe people who are more open, will be the ones who show more accommodation towards this heard voice. Results to be announced. But yeah, so I mean, it's coming at it from a different way, looking at just personality differences as opposed to aptitude.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. Individual differences. We never look at these. We kind of put people into the boxes of, okay, here's our upper middle class older women, or here are the people with this network score, and we kind of we look at these more general predictors, whether it's a social network score or some sort of demographic attributes, and of course the linguistic predictors, but then any sort of differences between people, like the person in the cell who acts weird, that's just noise, right? And we tend to talk about it like, oh, this person's weird, but it's because of this, and we like come up with the ad hoc explanation about why that person would be weird. But it'd be interesting to see if like there are actually additional differences that we could look at. Like, why are some people more likely to participate in an ongoing change, even more so than you would expect given their age and their gender and their place in the social network? So totally agreed. I think that's a great new topic of research.